In occupied Europe during World War II, hunger was not an abstraction. It was a daily calculation measured in calories, risk and silence. Civilians lived under ration systems that barely sustained life, while occupying armies requisitioned crops, livestock and preserved goods to feed their own troops. What history rarely emphasizes is that many soldiers were not well fed either. Supply lines broke down, corruption was rampant, and frontline units often went hungry. In that environment, families who survived did so not because they had more food, but because they hid the right food in the right way. For 1 full minute, consider this reality. A knock at the door could mean confiscation, arrest, or worse. Cupboards were searched, cellars inspected, and livestock counted. Families learned quickly that survival depended on storing foods that soldiers overlooked, undervalued, or could not easily transport. These were not luxuries. They were calculated choices based on nutrition, shelf life, and concealment. Root vegetables were hidden because they fed bodies without drawing attention. Potatoes, turnips, parsnips and beets were the backbone of civilian survival. These foods could be grown quietly, harvested late and stored underground, where inspections rarely reached. Families buried them in garden pits lined with straw or sand, sometimes beneath manure piles to discourage digging. Soldiers often dismissed root vegetables as peasant food and focused instead on bread, meat and alcohol. The practical lesson today is straightforward. Foods that store well without refrigeration and tolerate imperfect conditions are invaluable. A modern equivalent is storing potatoes or carrots in breathable containers in cool, dark spaces rather than relying entirely on refrigerated systems. Dried legumes were often hidden because, well, they looked pretty insignificant, but actually delivered a good deal of protein. Beans, lentils and peas were easy to conceal and, honestly, easy to dismiss. You know, a handful of dried legumes didn't look like much to a soldier searching for sacks of grain, yet these foods provided protein, calories and, importantly, long-term storage. Families would hide them inside walls, under floorboards, and sometimes even sew them into cloth bags, disguised as insulation. Today, this kind of thinking translates into understanding density. Small volumes of food with high nutritional return are really more valuable than bulky, perishable items. Dried beans, for example, remain one of the most efficient survival foods available. Fermented vegetables, you see, survived inspections and preserved people's health. Cabbage fermented into sauerkraut, cucumbers into pickles, and beets into sour preserves were often hidden in crocks behind false walls or tucked away under stairs. Soldiers frequently avoided fermented foods, either because of the smell or just plain unfamiliarity. These foods, though, preserved vitamins, especially vitamin C, which, as you might imagine, prevented illness during those tough winter shortages. You know, modern households can replicate this easily. Learning basic fermentation not only extends shelf life, but also maintains nutrition without electricity, which is, well, a lesson directly inherited from those wartime kitchens. Back then, animal fats were hidden because, honestly, calories mattered more than taste. Lard, tallow, and rendered fat were among the most carefully concealed items. Fat was absolutely essential for survival, providing energy when carbohydrates were scarce. Families stored fats in sealed jars, hidden inside chimneys, buried in cold soil, or even disguised beneath ash bins. These days, the modern survival application is often misunderstood. Calories are not all equal. Fat actually remains the most efficient energy source by weight, and, well, understanding how to store it safely is still a pretty critical skill. You know, dried fruits were hidden because they doubled as both food and currency. Apples, pears and plums were sliced, dried, and then stored away in cloth sacks or sometimes jars buried deep in cellars. These foods, well, they lasted for months and could be eaten sparingly or traded quietly for other necessities. Interestingly, soldiers often ignored them, preferring bread or alcohol instead. So this teaches us a dual-use principle. Foods that can be consumed or exchanged discreetly, well, they really do increase resilience in constrained systems. Honey was hidden because it never spoiled and honestly served multiple roles. It was prized not just as food, but also as medicine and a preservative. Families would hide jars inside walls, hollow logs, or even sealed containers buried in their gardens. Soldiers rarely confiscated it, unless it was immediately visible. Modern preparedness, you know, benefits from the same logic. Non-perishable foods with medicinal value, well, they reduce dependence on external systems. Seeds were hidden because survival extended beyond the current season. Perhaps the most important hidden food was not food at all. Seeds were concealed in matchboxes, sewn into clothing, or hidden inside furniture joints. Families understood that eating everything meant starvation later. This is a lesson often ignored today. Food storage without seed preservation is, frankly, short-term thinking. Cheese and cured meats were hidden because, well, they were portable nutrition. Hard cheeses and smoked meats were wrapped in cloth and buried in cool soil, or, you know, hidden up in the rafters. These foods were calorie-dense and slow to spoil. Soldiers often seized fresh meat, but more often than not overlooked preserved forms. The practical takeaway is clear. Preservation methods that reduce smell, moisture and visibility, well, they really do increase survival odds. Flour substitutes were hidden because, you know, bread was the first target. Acorn flour, chestnut meal and barley substitutes were hidden because wheat flour was always confiscated first. Families learned to grind alternative grains quietly and bake when inspections were unlikely. This underscores adaptability. Knowing substitutes honestly prevents dependency on single food sources. These 9 foods were not chosen randomly. They were selected through hard experience, observation and loss. Families who survived did so by thinking like logisticians, not consumers. They understood concealment, nutrition and patience. If this kind of historically grounded survival knowledge matters to you, subscribe to the channel and share this video with someone who values lessons learned the hard way. History does not repeat itself, but scarcity does, and the past remains one of our most reliable teachers.